Louisiana horror, feeding turtles with human flesh, and the chilling truth beneath the pond. Hello everyone. Before we begin
Stop
today's
resisting!
video, I need your help. We've noticed
Get on
that
the
the
ground
channel
now!
is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Imagine a quiet town where everyone knows each other's name, where the porch lights glow warm at dusk, and where trust feels unshakable until one night, behind those familiar walls, a truth so dark is uncovered that it changes everything forever. What would drive a son to betray the very people who gave him life? And how did a small pond in a Louisiana backyard hold the secret that no one could ignore? This is not just a crime story. It's a story of family, silence, and the choices that echo long after they're made. Stay with me as we unfold the Miller tragedy, piece by piece, and discover the chilling lesson hidden beneath the surface. If you don't want to miss stories like this, real cases told with care and depth, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Each week, we dive into the mysteries that haunt quiet towns and the lessons they leave behind. The town of Houma, Louisiana, sat quiet that early September evening in 2022. The air was heavy with the smell of the bayou, where the last whispers of summer clung to the water like a stubborn memory. People in Houma were used to the rhythm of small-town life, fishing boats coming back at dusk, neighbors sharing news on front porches, and children riding their bikes down cracked sidewalks until the streetlights flickered on. It was the kind of town where everyone seemed to know each other's business, and nothing much ever stayed hidden for long. So when George and Martha Miller, a couple well into their 60s, suddenly vanished, the town could feel the silence they left behind. George was a retired sawmill worker, a man with strong hands and a steady routine. Martha, gentle and soft-spoken, was known for her garden and her strange affection for the turtles she raised in a small pond behind their house. To neighbors, the Millers represented everything steady and dependable, humble folks who lived a quiet, decent life. At first, their absence didn't seem unusual. People assumed they had gone to visit relatives or perhaps taken a short trip out of town. After all, retirement was supposed to be a time for rest, wasn't it? But as the days stretched into weeks, unease began to ripple through the neighborhood. Their mailbox grew heavy with unopened letters, the curtains stayed drawn, and the once lively backyard pond looked eerily still, except for the slow movements of the turtles. The one person who didn't seem worried was their only son, Daniel Miller. At 32, Daniel still lived with his parents in their modest one-story home at the edge of town. To the neighbors, he appeared dutiful and polite. He mowed the lawn, waved to passers-by, and never forgot to feed the turtles his mother loved so dearly. When Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman from next door, asked where George and Martha had gone, Daniel smiled and answered with ease. His parents, he said, had traveled to a Buddhist temple in New Orleans for a month-long retreat. They needed peace, he explained, time away from the worries of the world. His words carried the kind of certainty that left no room for doubt. He even pointed to a bag of clothes set neatly by the porch, as if his parents had left in a hurry that very morning. Mrs. Thompson accepted the explanation, nodding with approval at the idea of two aging souls seeking spiritual comfort. Daniel's calm voice and polite manner disarmed suspicion before it had a chance to form. And so, life in Houma carried on, the surface undisturbed. Neighbors waved to Daniel as he passed by, believing he was simply keeping the house in order until George and Martha returned. But beneath the still waters of the Millers' turtle pond, something unspeakable was waiting. In time, it would rise to the surface, bringing with it a truth so dark that Houma would never look at the Miller family the same way again. Daniel Miller played his role with unsettling precision. Every morning, as the sun crept over the swamps of Houma, he stepped outside carrying a bucket of vegetables and scraps to feed the turtles in the pond. Neighbors often saw him bent over the water, scattering food with the same gentle rhythm his mother, Martha, had once used. To them, it was comforting proof that life at the Miller house carried on as usual. But for Daniel, every gesture was part of a performance, carefully rehearsed to mask the horror hidden just beneath the surface. He had learned quickly that small towns notice everything. A yard left unkempt, a trash bin overflowing, a curtain left open too late at night. These were the details that drew whispers. And so, Daniel went about his days in a way that seemed almost too perfect. The lawn was trimmed, the flower beds watered, and the porch swept clean. When someone passed by, he offered a polite nod, sometimes even a smile. He wanted them to believe that nothing had changed, that George and Martha would be back before long. But he didn't stop there. Daniel began to weave his parents into conversations with neighbors, as if they were still part of the everyday rhythm of life. One afternoon, he carried a pie across the street to the Thompsons, saying his mother had baked it before leaving town and insisted they have it. Another time, he stopped by Mr. Howard's porch with a bag of pecans, explaining his father had asked him to share them with friends. Each gesture was a thread in the story he was spinning, a story that painted him as the faithful son keeping the household steady. The neighbors, perhaps because they wanted to believe in the goodness of the Millers, accepted the tale without question. Mrs. Thompson even praised Daniel to her church friends, saying how devoted he was, how well he looked after things, while George and Martha pursued their spiritual retreat. In a town where gossip traveled faster than the tide, Daniel had managed to control the narrative. Still, there were cracks, faint ones, that only the sharpest eyes might catch. On more than one occasion, Mrs. Thompson thought Daniel's smile looked forced, as though it slipped too quickly from his lips once he turned away. Emily Johnson, the 12-year-old girl from down the street, told her mother she had seen Daniel at the pond late at night, standing still by the water with no food in his hands. But children's stories were easy to dismiss, especially when adults preferred the comfort of a simple explanation. Daniel knew how to cover those cracks. When asked why his parents hadn't called or written, he would shrug and say the temple discouraged communication during meditation retreats. They want to clear their minds, he explained, with a tone that sounded almost proud. And when someone asked if he missed them, he placed his hand over his heart and said softly, "Of course I do, but I know this time away is good for them." What no one knew was that Daniel rehearsed these lines in front of his bedroom mirror at night. He practiced his expressions, the slight lift of the eyebrows, the warm timbre of his voice. He understood that lies, to be believed, had to be delivered with conviction. And so, each morning when he faced the town, he wore the mask of a devoted son, while beneath it, fear gnawed at him, like the murky waters gnawed at the truth below the pond. The irony was cruel. The very turtles his mother had raised with such love were now the only creatures that knew the secret. Their patterns had changed. Instead of swimming freely across the pond, they clustered together near the northwest corner, stirring the water into a constant murk. Daniel noticed it too, but he told himself it didn't matter. As long as people saw him feeding them, no one would ask questions. Yet the sight unsettled him, and some nights he lay awake, hearing the faint splash of shells against the water, like a reminder that the pond would not keep quiet forever. In his quiet moments, the act began to wear on him. Sitting alone in the living room at night, the house silent except for the faint hum of crickets outside, he sometimes imagined he heard his mother's voice calling his name. Other times, he thought he could smell the faint trace of her cooking in the kitchen, though he hadn't turned on the stove in days. He pushed these thoughts away, drowning them with the constant reminder that he had no choice. He told himself that survival required lies, and he would carry them as far as necessary. For weeks, Daniel's performance worked. The neighbors trusted him, and the police had no reason to question the Miller family's absence. On the surface, everything appeared normal. But beneath that surface, beneath the calm waters of the turtle pond, evidence of his crime waited, restless and unforgiving. And though Daniel believed he had crafted the perfect illusion, he had forgotten one truth that small towns know too well: nothing stays hidden forever. Linda Carter was not the kind of woman who ignored her instincts. At 60 years old, with silver threads streaking her dark hair, she carried the blunt honesty of someone who had lived a hard but steady life. She had grown up alongside her brother George, knew his habits, his temper, and his quiet loyalty to family. When her calls to George and Martha went unanswered for nearly 2 weeks, unease tightened in her chest like a knot that would not loosen. On a brisk Saturday morning, Linda boarded a bus from her town in Lafayette and made the 2-hour ride down to Houma. She didn't bother with breakfast. Worry had stolen her appetite. As the bus rattled along the highway, She stared out the window, her thoughts circling. George and Martha had never been unreachable. Even when they traveled to visit cousins in Mississippi, George always called to check in. Something was wrong, Linda could feel it. When she arrived at the Miller home, Daniel was sweeping leaves from the porch. He looked up, startled, when he saw her. For a brief second, his face stiffened, as if he hadn't expected anyone from the family to show up. Then, just as quickly, he forced a smile. "Aunt Linda," he said warmly, though the warmth never reached his eyes. "What a surprise! I didn't know you were coming." Linda didn't bother with pleasantries. She set her bag down on the porch and looked him straight in the eye. "Where are your parents, Daniel? I've been calling for days." Not a word. Not even a message. Daniel hesitated, then slipped into the same story he had been telling the neighbors. His parents, he said, had gone to a temple retreat in New Orleans, and the place discouraged phone calls. He delivered it smoothly, but his gaze slid away before he finished the sentence. "George, at a meditation retreat?" Linda cut in, her voice sharp. "Your daddy never sat still for 5 minutes in his life. And your mama? She wouldn't go anywhere without telling me first. Not after all these years." The words landed like stones. Daniel's smile faltered. He shifted the broom from one hand to the other, avoiding her eyes. "It was a last-minute decision," he muttered. "They thought it would be good for them. Mom asked me to take care of the turtles while they were gone." Linda's suspicion deepened. The boy, she remembered the polite, bookish nephew, had always met her eyes when he spoke. Now he couldn't hold her gaze. Something about the way his fingers tightened around the broom handle told her he was hiding something. She lowered her voice. "Listen to me, Daniel. Just last month, your mama called me crying because you wanted to sell that back lot to pay your debts. Now all of a sudden they disappear, and you've got some story about a temple nobody's ever heard of. If I don't hear from your parents today, I'm calling the police." Daniel's face drained of color. "Aunt Linda, please don't jump to conclusions," he stammered, reaching out as if to grab her arm. "I'll call them again, I promise. Maybe the reception is just bad out there." Linda pulled her arm back. "I know my brother Daniel. He doesn't just vanish. And your mama wouldn't leave without telling me. So unless you can put me on the phone with them, I'm not buying this story." His lips trembled as he forced a weak smile. "You've got it wrong, Aunt Linda. Everything's fine." But the smile vanished the second she pressed further. "If they're really at some temple," she said, pointing toward the house, "then you won't mind if I look around, will you?" Daniel froze, panic flickering across his features before he quickly masked it. "There's nothing to see," he said softly. "They'll be back before long. You just have to trust me." Linda shook her head. "Trust has to be earned. And right now, you're not giving me a reason." For a fleeting moment, Daniel's eyes drifted toward the backyard, toward the quiet pond where the turtles stirred the water. It was no more than a glance, but Linda caught it. Her stomach clenched. Whatever secret Daniel was keeping, it was tied to that pond. She didn't press further, not yet. Instead, she picked up her bag, straightened her shoulders, and gave him one last look. "You'd better think carefully, Daniel, because lies have a way of catching up." As she walked away, Daniel sank into the porch chair, his broom clattering to the ground. He buried his face in his hands, the mask slipping for the first time since this charade began. He knew then that his carefully built story was starting to crumble, and it was his own aunt who had struck the first crack. Detective Samuel Brooks had spent more than 25 years walking crime scenes across Louisiana, from the rowdy streets of New Orleans to the quiet fishing towns along the Gulf. He was a man of steady gait and measured words, known in the department not for loud declarations, but for the way he noticed what others missed. When the Houma police received a call from Linda Carter reporting her brother and sister-in-law missing under suspicious circumstances, Brooks took the case himself. It was a gray afternoon when he drove down Bayou Gardens Boulevard and pulled up to the Miller residence, a modest single-story home tucked at the end of a narrow street. The house looked peaceful at first glance, its yard neatly trimmed, the porch swept clean, the flower beds watered. Too clean, Brooks thought as he stepped out of his unmarked sedan. The air carried the heavy scent of bleach, faintly mixed with the bayou's damp musk, and that detail alone was enough to quicken his instincts. Daniel Miller greeted him at the door with a polite smile and a calm voice, offering iced tea as if the visit were nothing more than a social call. Brooks accepted but said little, letting silence stretch. In his years on the job, he had learned that silence pressed harder than questions. People who lied often feared silence, rushing to fill it. Daniel spoke smoothly, repeating that his parents had traveled for meditation and would be back soon. His words were neat, too neat, each one falling as if rehearsed. He never stumbled, but his eyes kept drifting toward the floor, as though afraid Brooks might read the truth in them. Inside, the house was spotless, but too spotless. The living room rug looked freshly shampooed, the kitchen tiles reeked of disinfectant, and even the hallway gleamed as if scrubbed just hours before. Brooks paused by the sink and noticed a rag soaking in a bucket of water tinged faintly pink. He said nothing, only nodded as though satisfied, but in his mind the questions multiplied. Stepping out to the backyard, he found the pond Martha had been known for, the one where she raised her turtles. The water was murky, clouded with silt, and the turtles hovered in an unusual cluster at the far end. Brooks crouched, studying the surface. A faint bubble rose, popped, and released a sour note into the air before fading. When he turned back, Daniel stood stiffly on the porch, arms crossed, watching. Brooks asked gently, almost casually, if there had been any arguments in the house recently. Daniel straightened and replied quickly that his father sometimes grew irritable, that they had disagreed about selling land, but it was nothing serious. His words came too fast, as if he had memorized them. Brooks filed the detail away. He had seen it before, sons who killed fathers, husbands who killed wives, all insisting early on that disagreements were harmless. Before leaving, Brooks walked once more through the house, paying attention not to what was there, but to what was missing. No open mail on the counter, no half-read newspaper by George's chair, no teacup on the windowsill where Martha usually let the steam fog the glass. Everything looked staged, stripped of life, as though the house itself had been forced into silence. He thanked Daniel for the tea, shook his hand, and promised they would keep in touch. As he returned to his car, Linda Carter met him at the edge of the yard, her arms crossed tightly. "That boy's lying," she said in a voice both angry and trembling. Brooks placed a steady hand on her shoulder and told her quietly, "We'll find out." That night, back at the station, Brooks laid out his notes. He circled the pond, the bleach, the hurried explanations, and the glance Daniel had cast toward the backyard when pressed by his aunt. The case was still only suspicion, no evidence solid enough for a warrant, but his gut told him the truth was hidden in that water. He had worked too many cases not to recognize the signs. A lie spoken too smoothly, a house scrubbed too clean, a man standing just a little too still when silence pressed against him. In Houma, the Millers were still just a missing persons report, but to Detective Brooks, the investigation had already shifted. This was no ordinary disappearance. It was the beginning of something far darker, and the still waters of the turtle pond were whispering that they would not stay still for long. In the days after Detective Brooks's first visit, the Miller house became the quiet center of Houma's attention. At first, neighbors repeated Daniel's words with confidence, saying George and Martha were away for a meditation retreat. But as the week stretched on with no phone call, no postcard, no sign from relatives, certainty began to erode. People lowered their voices when they spoke of the Millers, as though the silence itself carried weight. It was the pond that stirred the most whispers. Mrs. Thompson, from her kitchen window, noticed the turtles gathering in one corner, circling in restless patterns. She mentioned it to Mr. Howard, who had helped George build the pond years earlier. Howard frowned and muttered that turtles didn't normally stay in one place unless something unusual drew them there. Soon others were talking too, mothers pulling their children away from the fence, children daring each other to peek and then running off pale-faced. The still water seemed to hold a secret, and Houma felt it. Brooks returned one afternoon with a young officer, Mark Evans. Mark had grown up with Daniel, once sat beside him in school, and the sight of his old classmate standing stiffly on the porch unsettled him. Daniel answered their questions politely, his words smooth, but Mark could not ignore the tension in his jaw, or the way his eyes flicked toward the pond whenever silence fell. Brooks caught it too, but unlike Mark, he did not hesitate to write the detail down. "Animals know," Brooks murmured as he crouched by the water, stirring the surface with a stick. A trail of bubbles broke, releasing a sour odor. Mark's stomach tightened. By now, the neighbors were no longer passive. Mrs. Thompson told Brooks she had seen Daniel standing by the pond late at night, motionless, sometimes for nearly half an hour. Young Emily Johnson admitted she had noticed the same thing, Daniel staring into the water without food in his hands, as though waiting for something. Each account added weight to the growing suspicion. That evening, Brooks gathered his team. Around the table lay his notes: the too clean house, the evasive answers, the frightened glance toward the backyard, and now the neighbors' testimonies. None of it proved anything, but together it painted a picture darker than a simple disappearance. "We're not looking for travelers," Brooks told them flatly. "We're looking for a crime scene." The following day, water samples from the pond were sent for testing. When the results came back, they showed bacterial levels consistent with decomposition. A biologist from Baton Rouge explained that such readings suggested the breakdown of something larger than fish or small animals. It was the first real sign that Brooks's instincts were correct. Word spread through town despite official silence. By nightfall, people gathered near the Miller property, whispering, pointing toward the backyard as if the truth might rise out of the pond by itself. Inside the house, Daniel's mask began to slip. He kept the curtains drawn and moved through the rooms like a ghost. His once practiced calm sounded hollow, his voice thinner, his steps heavier. Mark, watching from outside during patrol, felt torn in two: one half the officer, sworn to uncover the truth, the other half, the boy who still remembered sitting beside Daniel in class, sharing jokes in the back row. One evening he admitted to Brooks, "I don't want to believe it, but everything we're seeing, I can't ignore it." Brooks placed a steady hand on his shoulder and said, "It's never easy when guilt wears a familiar face. But truth doesn't care about comfort." The investigation had shifted. The Miller case was no longer about missing persons. The pond behind their house had become the silent center of suspicion, a dark mirror reflecting back the unease of the entire town. Plans were drawn to drain it, though paperwork and approval would take days. Until then, officers were told to keep watch and neighbors kept their distance. Houma waited in uneasy silence, knowing that when the water was finally lowered, the truth waiting beneath would not only condemn a man but leave a scar on the town itself. The morning the pumps arrived, Houma seemed to hold its breath. Trucks lined the narrow street, their engines rumbling as officers carried heavy hoses into the Miller backyard. Neighbors gathered at a distance, arms folded, voices hushed, watching as though the very ground were about to confess. For weeks, whispers had circled around the Miller's pond. Today, the water itself would be forced to speak. Detective Brooks oversaw the setup with his usual calm, though his eyes never left the pond. Workers started the pump, and a low roar filled the air as water surged through the hoses into the drainage ditch beyond the property. The turtles, disturbed, thrashed, and circled until animal control officers carefully lifted them into holding bins. Their shells clattered against the plastic as if protesting the intrusion. On the porch, Daniel sat slouched in a chair, lips pressed tightly together, watching every movement with a stillness that made him look carved from stone. The pond lowered slowly, exposing moss-darkened stones along the edges. At first, nothing unusual appeared, just branches, mud, and the ripple of disturbed silt. But as the hours passed, the smell changed. What began as a faint sour note grew into a heavier odor, unmistakable to Brooks, who had walked too many crime scenes not to recognize it. He said nothing, only signaled for the pump to continue. A few neighbors covered their mouths. Others stepped back, yet none looked away. By mid-morning, debris began to emerge, a rusted garden trowel, broken branches, scraps of netting. Officers took notes and photographs, but everyone's attention fixed on the northwest corner, the same place the turtles had circled for weeks. Bubbles rose from that patch of mud, breaking the surface with a hiss that carried the foul scent stronger than before. Brooks crouched nearby, his gaze steady, waiting. At last, something caught the light. An officer reached in with a long pole and hooked it gently from the muck. The object lifted free, dripping with dark water. It was a shoe, battered, waterlogged, the plain kind Martha Miller wore daily as she tended her garden. For a moment the yard fell into silence. Even the pump seemed muted as the officer slid the shoe into an evidence bag. Brooks exhaled, his jaw tightening. It was not yet a body, not yet proof beyond doubt, but it was the first voice rising from the pond's silence. On the porch, Daniel's fingers clenched the wooden armrest so tightly his knuckles whitened. His eyes flicked to the pond and away again, as if even a glance might betray him. Mark Evans, standing near the pump controls, felt his chest tighten. He remembered the boy Daniel had been in school, restless but full of life. The man before him now looked like a shadow of that memory, a figure shrinking under the weight of secrets. Brooks ordered the pumping slowed. The mud at the bottom was soft, treacherous, and if there was more to be found, it needed to be preserved. Officers marked the location, photographed every angle, and carefully covered the exposed section with tarps. The pump was shut down, the sudden quiet ringing louder than the machine's roar. The waterline was low now, exposing broad patches of muck, slick and dark, refusing to give up its secret all at once. Neighbors dispersed reluctantly, some whispering prayers, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Houma was not a town used to spectacle, but the Miller house had become one, its pond transformed into the center of fear and fascination. Mark lingered, his eyes on Daniel, who had disappeared inside without a word. The silence he left behind was heavier than anything he might have spoken. As Brooks packed his notes, he felt the weight of certainty settle in his chest. The shoe was only the beginning. Tomorrow, when the water drained fully, the pond would have no choice but to yield the truth. And when it did, it would not only condemn a man but scar an entire town that had once believed the Miller name stood for decency and trust. The next morning arrived under a sky, the color of steel, the clouds pressed low over Houma as though the town itself were bracing for what was to come. By the time the sheriff's trucks rolled once more into Bayou Gardens Boulevard, people had already gathered behind the taped line, not with curiosity this time, but with a hush that felt almost like reverence. The Millers' backyard, once a place of laughter and gardening, now carried the weight of expectation, as if everyone present knew they were about to witness something that would mark the town forever. Detective Brooks moved among the crew with his usual quiet authority, his coffee cooling in one hand as he gave measured instructions. The pumps roared to life, water rushing out of the pond faster than the day before. With every inch the level dropped, the air grew heavier, the smell sharpening until it clung to the skin. Brooks did not flinch. To him it was familiar, the grim scent that always accompanied hidden truth finally forcing its way into daylight. Daniel leaned against the porch railing, his arms folded tight across his chest. He did not pace or shout. Instead, a faint tremor ran through his leg, tapping against the wooden boards with a nervous rhythm he could not control. His lips pressed so hard together they bled at the corners, yet his eyes never strayed far from the shrinking water. Mark Evans stood near the pump controls, his stomach twisting as the pond dwindled into a basin of mud and dark pools. Each gurgle of the hose felt like a countdown. He remembered Daniel in high school, how they once laughed through long afternoons, and the image clashed so violently with the man now standing pale and rigid on the porch that it nearly stole his breath. By late morning, the water was nearly gone. Officers stepped carefully into the muck, probing with poles. One pole struck resistance, then another. Mud shifted, releasing a foul bubble that burst at the surface. The officers exchanged looks, then began to work together, pulling at what seemed like netting tangled with heavy stones. The effort was slow, deliberate, every movement echoing in the silence of the crowd. When the bundle broke the surface, the truth followed. The netting clung to two human shapes bound together, their clothes still visible beneath layers of silt, the faded house dress Martha wore so often, the frayed work shirt George favored. Ropes bit into the fabric, and rocks sagged in the mesh, crude anchors that had failed to hold forever. A wave of silence swept across the yard. No one cried out, no one gasped. It was the silence of realization, deep and collective, the kind that fell over a town when innocence was stripped away. Brooks removed his hat, his face carved with grim certainty. Officers bent to their work, covering the bodies with tarps and lifting them with care. Each gesture carried the weight of respect, but also the finality of truth. Mark swallowed hard, his throat burning. He had seen death before, but never like this, never pulled from the mud of a backyard pond, never tied to a friend he had once trusted. His eyes flicked to Daniel, who had sunk into a chair, his hands trembling against his knees. His eyes glistened red, not with tears, but with a hollow resignation, as though some part of him had known this moment was inevitable. The bodies were carried past the tape line to waiting vans. The neighbors, who only days ago had gossiped in whispers, now stood in a silence that resembled mourning. Some bowed their heads, others turned away, but none spoke. It was as if the pond had become a graveyard, and speaking aloud would be disrespect. When the vans pulled away, Brooks remained by the edge of the pond, staring at the mud that still stank of rot and secrets. He had seen enough to know the case was no longer a question of suspicion. This was confirmation, undeniable and brutal. The Miller story would not be written as a mystery of the missing, but as a tragedy of betrayal. Daniel stayed seated on the porch, unmoving, his face slack. For the first time, the mask of composure was gone. In its place was the vacant stare of a man who knew the water had turned against him, that the silence he had clung to had ended. Houma no longer needed rumors. The pond had told the truth, and the truth was heavier than any words Daniel might have spoken. The interrogation room at the Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's Office was small and bare, its gray cinder-block walls swallowing sound. A single bulb hummed above the table where Daniel Miller sat, shoulders sagging, wrists free but heavy, as if chained by his own silence. He had not asked for a lawyer, had not offered protest when officers brought him in. Now he sat motionless, eyes lowered, while Detective Brooks watched him from across the table. Brooks did not rush. He placed a folder down, slid a cup of water forward, and folded his hands. Minutes stretched, the hum of the light the only sound. In his long career, Brooks had learned that silence was a sharper blade than questions. Liars tried to fill it, the guilty tried to endure it, but eventually it carved through both. Daniel's fingers worked against each other on the tabletop, rubbing the skin raw, then stilling, then starting again. His lips parted, closed, parted again. At last Brooks spoke, his tone low and even. "We found them, Daniel. Your parents. They weren't on a retreat, you know that." The words fell heavy, not shouted, but steady as a judge's gavel. Daniel's shoulders twitched. He inhaled sharply, but gave no answer. Brooks opened the folder. One by one he set photographs on the table. The shoe, the torn netting, the tarps covering the bodies lifted from the pond. He did not push them forward or demand Daniel look, yet Daniel's eyes moved to them and stayed, widening slightly, his breathing quickening until each exhale rasped through clenched teeth, his hands locked tighter, the knuckles paling. "You've carried this for weeks," Brooks continued, his voice almost gentle, "feeding the turtles, keeping the yard neat, waving to neighbors. But every mask cracks, Daniel. Yours already has." Daniel's lips trembled. For a moment he looked like he might speak, then bit down until a thin line of red appeared. Mark Evans, seated quietly in the corner, felt his stomach knot. He had seen classmates lie to teachers, dodge blame for small mistakes, but he had never seen Daniel like this, trapped not by rules, but by truth. Brooks leaned forward slightly, no threat in his eyes, only insistence. "Don't let the mud speak for you. Tell me what happened that night." Daniel's throat bobbed. His fingers twisted harder until his knuckles looked bruised. At last a sound came, cracked and hoarse. "They wouldn't listen," he whispered, so faint Mark barely heard it. His gaze stayed fixed on the table, as if afraid the words themselves would turn on him. Brooks nodded once, not pushing, not pulling, only leaving space. Daniel's breath shuddered. "I asked, I begged. I told them I didn't have time, that I needed money, I was in trouble." His voice rose, then faltered. "Dad said no. Mom tried to calm me, but he kept saying no. He said I was nothing but—" His voice broke. He pressed his fists against his temples, shaking his head. For a long moment the room was still except for his uneven breaths. Then the words spilled out again, jagged and broken. I didn't mean for it to go that far." He grabbed me. I grabbed the wood. I swung. He fell. Mom screamed. "I tried." He choked, palms dragging down his face. "I tried to stop her, but I couldn't. I didn't think. I couldn't think." Tears streaked through the grime of sleepless days, but they were not tears of mourning. They were the collapse of a man who had run out of places to hide. Brooks closed the folder gently, his voice steady. "You made choices that night, Daniel. Not fate, not chance. Choices." For the first time Daniel looked at him, eyes bloodshot, lips raw from being bitten. There was no denial left, no story of temples or retreats. Only exhaustion, the kind that comes when lies no longer hold. The confession was only partial, not formal, but the room had shifted. Silence had turned into words, and once spoken, words could not be reclaimed. Mark sat rigid in his chair, the boy he once remembered, gone forever, replaced by a man hollowed out by guilt and fear. Outside, the sheriff's office carried on with phones ringing and boots echoing on linoleum floors, but inside that small gray room time felt suspended. Daniel Miller had spoken at last, and in that fragile whisper, the fall of a family had finally begun to take shape. Daniel's voice faltered at first, then steadied into a trembling rhythm, as though once the words began, they could no longer be stopped. His eyes stayed on the table, unfocused, as if he were speaking not to Brooks or to Mark, but to the memory of that night itself. "It was late," he said, his tone flat, almost distant. "I had been out all day, trying to borrow money, trying to sell my truck, anything. Nobody would help me. By the time I got home, it was past 10. Dad was at the kitchen table, writing in that old notebook like always, adding numbers, counting every penny. Mom was on the couch, half asleep with a book. The whole house smelled like coffee that had sat too long." He rubbed his palms together until the skin turned red. "I told them I needed money again. I said the debt was due in the morning, that men were coming for me. I begged him. I begged her. Dad didn't even look up at first. He just said no, not again. He said the land wasn't mine to sell, that it belonged to the family. I told him it was my life on the line. He looked at me like I was nothing." Daniel's voice cracked, and he pressed his hands against his face before continuing. "Mom tried to speak soft, the way she always did. She said maybe there was another way. Maybe we could talk in the morning. But Dad slammed his hand on the table and said he was finished, that he wouldn't give me another dollar. He called me a failure, said he should have cut me loose years ago." His hands dropped back to the table, trembling. "I lost it. I don't even remember standing up. One second I was shouting, the next I was at the corner of the kitchen. My hand grabbed that piece of wood by the back door. I didn't plan it. I didn't think. He tried to stop me, and I swung. Just once. That's all it took." He dropped on the floor without a sound. The room went quiet except for the rasp of Daniel's breathing. Mark's pen hung useless over his notebook, his mind stuck on the picture Daniel painted. Brooks sat still, letting the weight of the confession settle. Daniel's gaze turned glassy as he went on. "Mom screamed. She ran to him, tried to shake him awake. She turned to me like I was a stranger. She shouted my name, over and over. I panicked. I told her to stop, to be quiet. She wouldn't. She reached for the phone. I grabbed her before I even knew what I was doing. She fought, but I swung. And then it was quiet again. Too quiet." His voice fell into a whisper. I stood there staring at the blood. My hands shook so bad I thought I'd pass out. I thought about running. I thought about calling the police myself, but then I looked out the back window and saw the pond, and I thought maybe I could make it disappear. Maybe no one would know. His shoulders slumped, his words spilling faster now. I dragged them, both of them. I found the netting, tied the stones, pulled them across the yard. My arms gave out twice, but I kept going. I pushed them into the water. I remember the splash, the turtles scattering, then nothing but stillness. I scrubbed the floor until my skin burned. I threw out the rag. By morning, I fed the turtles like nothing had changed. When neighbors asked, I smiled and told them a story. His head dropped into his hands. I thought I could live with it. I thought I could be smarter than the truth. But the pond didn't stay quiet. The smell, the water, the turtles. Every night I sat on that porch waiting for the secret to crawl back up. I knew it would. I just didn't know when. Brooks leaned back, expression grave, the words no surprise but still heavy. Mark felt his chest tighten, the boy he once knew gone with every sentence. Daniel lifted his face at last, streaked with tears, his eyes hollow. I didn't mean for it to happen. I just couldn't stop once it started. And now they're gone because of me. News of Daniel Miller's confession spread through Houma faster than the sheriff's office could contain it. By the next morning, the case was no longer just a tragedy for one family. It was a wound for the entire town. Neighbors who once waved to George and Martha on their evening walks now gathered in small knots on porches and sidewalks, whispering with disbelief. The Millers had been the kind of people everyone thought they knew, and now their deaths felt like a betrayal shared by all. The pond, that had once been a place of curiosity, was roped off and guarded, yet people still walked by, unable to resist a glance, as if the murky water might somehow explain the darkness that had lived so close. At the center of the storm was Linda Carter, George's younger sister. She had been the first to speak up when Daniel's story didn't ring true, the one who pressed the family to demand answers. Now she moved through town with her back straight, her grief worn plain but her voice steady. People asked her when she had last seen her brother, if she had noticed any changes, if she had suspected Daniel. Each question was like a blade, because the truth was that she had suspected, and no one had wanted to believe her. One evening, Linda sat on her porch staring at the photographs the sheriff had asked her to identify. George's worn work shirt, Martha's faded dress, ordinary clothes that now served as evidence of death. She clenched the papers until the corners bent, and her hands ached. When a reporter asked for a statement, her reply was sharp but calm. "He wasn't raised to be a monster," she said. "He chose it. My brother and his wife gave him everything they had, and he threw it back at them. Don't tell me this was desperation. Desperation doesn't tie your parents in netting and sink them in the mud. Has Lee?" Her words cut through Houma like a bell. That Sunday, the pastor spoke carefully from the pulpit, reminding the congregation of forgiveness while acknowledging the deep hurt the community carried. But even in the church pews, the divide was clear. Some argued that Daniel had snapped under pressure, that debt and shame had twisted him beyond reason. Others shook their heads and refused to soften the truth. A man had murdered the very people who gave him life. Forgiveness felt impossibly far. For Mark Evans, the weight of it pressed harder than most. Friends stopped him on the street, asking if it was true he had sat in the room during Daniel's confession. He confirmed it, but offered no details. In private, he wrestled with memories of high school afternoons when Daniel had been just another restless boy, laughing in the back row, making plans for a future neither of them could have imagined. Now those memories felt like lies. More than once, Mark found himself standing near the Miller property, staring at the taped-off yard, wondering if he had ever really known his classmate at all. The whole town seemed to grieve. At the grocery store where Martha once chatted with the cashier, silence replaced small talk. At the sawmill where George had worked, the flag was lowered in his honor. Parents told children not to go near the Miller place, though a few still crept close, daring each other to peek at the drained pond as though it might still whisper secrets. Linda carried herself with determination. She organized a candlelight vigil on the courthouse steps, where the glow of flames flickered in the sticky Louisiana night. Neighbors gathered in silence until Linda's voice carried out clear. My brother and his wife deserved peace in their home, not betrayal in their final hour. If we take anything from this, let it be that love has to be steady, not blind. You can't rescue someone who refuses to save themselves. People nodded, some cried openly, and her words settled heavy but true. Brooks attended from a distance, standing at the edge of the crowd with his hat in his hands. He had closed cases before, but few left him with this kind of ache. He knew the courtroom would deliver judgment, but judgment could not restore the family, nor could it soothe the conscience of a town that had believed in the Millers for so long. In the days that followed, Houma adjusted slowly, uneasily. The Miller house stood dark and empty, its windows shuttered, its yard gone quiet. No one wanted to buy it. No one wanted to live there. It became a scar on the block, a silent reminder that evil does not always come from strangers. Sometimes it grows inside the very home where trust was planted. For Linda, the grief was sharp, but so was her resolve. She had lost her brother and sister-in-law, but more painfully, she had lost them to the hands of her own nephew. Still, she refused to let whispers and speculation be the final word. She spoke openly in church, at the store, to anyone who would listen, reminding people of George and Martha's kindness in life, rather than the horror of their deaths. And slowly, in her voice, Houma began to find a way forward, not forgetting, but learning. The courthouse in Houma had not seen such a crowd in years. On the morning of Daniel Miller's trial, people arrived early, filling every bench inside and standing shoulder to shoulder in the aisles. The hum of whispered conversations mixed with the creak of wooden pews, the air charged with a heavy anticipation. Some came because they had known George and Martha. some out of duty, and others simply because they needed to see with their own eyes how the story that had haunted the town would end. Daniel was led into the courtroom by deputies, shackled at the wrists, his head lowered. His once youthful face looked gaunt, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. He did not look at the people gathered. He did not look at Linda Carter, his aunt, who sat in the front row with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He kept his eyes on the floor as though even meeting another's gaze was more weight than he could bear. Judge Wallace called the court to order, his voice echoing with authority. The district attorney opened with a clear, steady recitation of the facts: the mounting debts, the arguments in the Miller home, the disappearance, and finally the discovery in the pond. One by one, pieces of evidence were shown: the shoe, the stained rag, the netting, the testimony of neighbors who noticed the smell and the turtles circling the same corner. It was not speculation anymore, but a story laid out with brutal clarity. Witnesses were called to the stand. Mrs. Thompson described the night she had seen Daniel standing by the pond far too long, his figure unmoving in the moonlight. Mr. Howard spoke of the day he had helped George build that pond years ago, his voice breaking when he explained how George once said he wanted a place of peace for the family to enjoy. And then Linda rose. She walked to the stand slowly, her grief written in the lines of her face. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. She told the court about the calls she had made, about the excuses Daniel had given her, and about the certainty that had driven her to contact the sheriff. Then she turned her eyes toward Daniel. "I never thought my own nephew would take the lives of the two people who gave him everything. But here we are." Her words hung in the air, heavier than any piece of evidence. The defense tried to paint Daniel as a desperate man crushed by circumstances, a man who snapped under the weight of debts he could not escape. They spoke of panic, of fear, of the absence of intent to kill. But when Daniel was asked if he wished to address the court, he did not echo his lawyer's words. He rose slowly, the chains at his wrists clinking, and spoke in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anyone to understand. They gave me everything, and I gave them nothing but pain. I wish I could take it back, but I can't." His shoulders shook, and he lowered his head. He said nothing else. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was clear and steady, guilty of first-degree murder on both counts. The room held its breath. Daniel did not move, did not cry out. He only let out a slow breath, as though the verdict was not news but confirmation of what he had already accepted. Judge Wallace delivered the sentence with grave formality. "The court finds that the crimes committed were deliberate and carried out with cruelty against the very people who gave you life. The law leaves no leniency. Daniel Miller, you are sentenced to death." The words fell over the courtroom like a storm. Some gasped softly, others bowed their heads in prayer. Linda sat very still, her eyes lowered, her hands trembling faintly in her lap. As deputies led Daniel out, he glanced once toward the benches. His eyes flickered over the crowd, pausing for a moment on Linda. There was no plea in his look, no anger, only a blankness that seemed to accept that everything had already been lost long before the gavel struck. The heavy doors closed behind him, and the room slowly exhaled. People filed out quietly, their footsteps echoing against the high ceiling. Outside, the Louisiana air was thick and warm, magnolia leaves stirring in the breeze. Conversations rose in low tones about justice, about tragedy, about how such a respected family had been shattered. Some spoke of relief, others of sorrow, but all carried the weight of what they had witnessed. For Houma, the trial did not bring closure, but it brought certainty. The story of the Millers was no longer a rumor or a suspicion whispered in backyards. It was fact, carved into the town's history by the judgment of law. And as the courthouse steps emptied and the crowd dispersed into the humid afternoon, a silence lingered, the silence of a community that knew it would never see itself the same way again. After the trial, Houma fell into an uneasy quiet. The verdict had been read, the sentence delivered, yet the town did not feel relieved. It was as if everyone carried a new weight, one that could not be lifted by the sound of a judge's gavel. The Miller case had ended in law, but in the streets, the stores, and the church pews, the story lingered like a shadow. The Miller house stood empty, its windows shuttered, the grass growing tall. No one stepped forward to cut it. No one swept the porch. A for sale sign appeared on the lawn, but weeks passed without a single inquiry. Children on their way home from school crossed to the opposite sidewalk, lowering their voices until they had passed it. At night, some neighbors swore they heard noises inside, though they knew it was only the house settling. Still, no one lingered near it after dark. The pond had been drained and filled with dirt under order of the parish, but that did not stop the stories. Some said that when the wind shifted, a sour odor still drifted from that corner of the yard. Others whispered that they heard splashes where no water remained. The most repeated tale was that the turtles returned at dusk, circling the patch of earth as if searching for something that could never be found. People knew it was unlikely, yet the whispers grew all the same. In a town that had seen horror so close, superstition was easier than silence. Linda Carter became the voice the community turned to. Though her grief was sharp, she spoke with strength at gatherings and in conversations on the street. She reminded neighbors to remember George and Martha not only for the way they died, but for the way they had lived with kindness, with faith, with a stubborn generosity. "Don't let the house be the only story left of them," she said more than once. "Remember the garden Martha planted, the poems George scribbled in the margins of newspapers, the way their door was always open." Her words gave people something gentler to hold on to, yet guilt still gnawed at some. Mrs. Thompson confessed she had often noticed Daniel pacing by the pond at night, but had convinced herself it was nothing. Mr. Howard, who had once helped George dig the first foundation for that pond, admitted he could not look at his own backyard without remembering that day of laughter soured by what came later. And Mark Evans, though he rarely spoke of it, spent sleepless nights hearing Daniel's broken confession replay in his head. The reminders were everywhere. The Miller pew at church stayed empty, a quiet scar in the congregation. The grocery store where Martha had once chatted with cashiers felt different without her presence. At the sawmill, George's old co-workers lowered their voices whenever his name was spoken, unable to separate the man they respected from the tragedy that had followed. But the town did not stop living. Neighbors planted flowers around the courthouse steps, where the vigil had once been held. A mural of magnolia blossoms appeared on the side of a downtown shop dedicated to the strength of family. Parents told their children the story carefully, not as a horror but as a lesson that choices carry weight, that desperation can twist love into something unrecognizable, and that the truth always rises, no matter how deep it is buried. Linda herself went back to the Miller house only once. She unlocked the door with shaking hands and stepped inside. The air was stale, tinged faintly with Martha's perfume and George's tobacco. She walked through the rooms in silence, the kitchen table with its worn grooves, the shelves lined with cookbooks, the photo albums still stacked neatly. She lingered in the living room, remembering holidays and birthdays, voices and laughter. Then she closed the door and locked it again, knowing she would never return. Houma had always been a town rooted in tradition, in faith, in the belief that family was the strongest bond. The Miller case cracked that belief but did not destroy it. Instead, it made people hold tighter to the families they had left, more mindful of the ways love could heal and the ways it could be twisted. In that sense, George and Martha's legacy lived on not in the horror of their deaths, but in the determination of their neighbors to cherish life more fiercely. The Miller house remained unsold, the pond buried under layers of soil. The for sale sign leaned with rust, faded by the Sunday. Yet the story never faded. It became part of Houma's identity, retold on porches and in sermons, not to sensationalize but to remind. Evil had come from within, but the town endured, and as the seasons turned, Houma learned to carry both grief and resilience, walking forward with George and Martha's memory as a quiet light that could never be buried. Detective Samuel Brooks stayed late in his office long after most of the sheriff's department had gone home. The Miller files lay spread across his desk, each page marked with interviews, evidence logs, and courtroom transcripts. He had closed many cases before, but this one clung to him differently. The facts were straightforward, the verdict certain, yet the echoes refused to quiet. What haunted him were not the details of the crime, but the silences. The silence of a home scrubbed too clean, the silence of a pond holding its secret, the silence that finally cracked when Daniel began to speak. Those silences told the real story. Mark Evans stopped by, still in uniform, his jacket slung loosely over one shoulder. He looked worn, his eyes shadowed by nights of restless sleep. Brooks poured him a cup of coffee without a word, and they sat together in the quiet hum of the office. Mark finally spoke. "Do you think he ever really understood?" His voice carried frustration and grief. "Daniel, do you think he understood what he did to them?" Brooks leaned back, staring at the darkened window. "He understood enough to admit it," he said. "But remorse and understanding are two different things. Remorse is feeling sorry for yourself. Understanding is seeing the people you hurt. I don't know if he ever got there." Mark lowered his gaze to the coffee in his hands. He had grown up alongside Daniel, shared classes and afternoons, believed in a friendship that now felt like a lie. "It's like I lost two families," he murmured. "George and Martha, and the friend I thought I had." Brooks studied him, the lines of experience on his face softening. "That's the hardest truth," he said. "The evidence explains how. Sometimes it even tells you why. But it can't explain how someone you knew becomes someone you don't recognize at all. And sometimes, Mark, you'll never have that answer." They sat together for a while longer, speaking not of crime scenes or testimony, but of people, of George with his steady work ethic, of Martha with her kindness, of Daniel as a boy who had once seemed so full of promise. They spoke quietly, letting memory reclaim a little of what the tragedy had stolen. A few days later, Brooks returned to the Miller property one last time before the parish claimed it. The house stood silent, blinds drawn, the air heavy with disuse. He walked through the room slowly, his steps echoing. At the back window he stopped, staring at the patch of ground where the pond had been filled. It looked ordinary now, just soil and grass, but Brooks knew better. Some places never stopped speaking, no matter how much earth you laid over them. Mark joined him, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Do you think places hold things?" he asked. "Memories, pain, the truth." Brooks considered before answering. "People carry those things. But sometimes when they can't, the land does it for them. That pond carried the truth Daniel tried to bury, and when the time came, it gave it back." They left together without saying much more. There was nothing left to do but let time work its slow repair. In the weeks that followed, Brooks kept thinking not of the crime, but of the lesson. The Miller case was about love given until it became indulgence, about help that turned into permission. George and Martha had carried their son's failures for too long, hoping each time would be the last. Brooks thought of his own grown children and wondered where the line really was between loving and letting go. Mark, too, carried the weight differently. He spoke less about Daniel himself and more about the importance of paying attention to the quiet signs of strain, to the cracks before they widened. He began volunteering at a youth program, talking to teenagers about choices, about how quickly a wrong turn could destroy a life. It was his way of making sense of what he had seen. Houma moved forward in its own way. The Miller house remained a scar, its windows blank, its yard untended. But the town carried the memory carefully, telling the story not to sensationalize but to remind. Neighbors spoke of it when warning their children, pastors worked it into sermons, and over time it became less a wound than a caution. One evening, Brooks sat on his own porch, watching dusk settle over the bayou. The air was heavy with the scent of water and pine. He thought of George and Martha, of the turtles in the pond, of the way the water had given up its secret. And he whispered to himself, a vow more than a prayer, to carry the story, not as horror, but as warning. Because in the end, that was all anyone could do. Remember and learn. Sometimes, the hardest stories are not about strangers in the dark, but about the people closest to us. The Miller tragedy is a reminder that love must walk hand in hand with responsibility. When affection turns into indulgence, it can blur the line between helping and enabling, and in that space, destruction can grow. It also teaches us that silence hides nothing forever. The truth always rises, no matter how deep it is buried. So, hold your families close, speak openly, and set boundaries with love. Cherish the people who give their lives to you, because nothing in this world can replace them once they are gone. If this story touched you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. How do you see the balance between love and accountability in family? And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories of crime, truth, and the lessons they leave behind, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive and shared with those who need to hear them most.